Hello again, my name is Stephen Burnett and I'm welcoming you back to another episode of Storytime for Grown-Ups. What do the Galapagos Islands and the uttermost part of the earth have in common? Geography perhaps, history certainly, and definitely the thread of cutting-edge exploration in an age when exploration carried some danger. A journey to the end of the earth is not what everyone contemplates for a working holiday. My plan was to fly to Santiago in Chile, spend some time in the capital and then head south to Puerto Montt and board a ship in Punta Arenas for the coastal sea journey to Ushuaia in Argentina. Now, I've previously made several trips to this interesting part of the world, but never with sufficient time to explore the southern coastal route, and this was the opportunity I'd been waiting for. There was another reason that I was traveling in this area, and that was to develop an enrichment tourism experience retracing the steps of Charles Darwin's Voyage on the Beagle. By sailing along some of the same passages as Darwin did and exploring some of the same inlets that he experienced in 1831, I know that some of the coastal passages close to Tierra del Fuego could be challenging, to say the least, with what my boating buddies call big weather. But if that was the price to pay for a genuine Charles Darwin experience, then why not? Here we see Charles Darwin, age 22, setting off on his journey right around the southern part of South America. The book itself was published in 1839, and here you can see the Beagle in full flight. It was later careened over in South America at the very tip of Tierra del Fuego for some repairs. He spent, of course, a considerable time on the Galapagos, where there are many, many islands to visit. This is where he gathered many of his specimens. He wrote a 770-page diary, 1,750 pages of notes, and of course he was obsessed and very much appreciated with the giant tortoises, which grow to about 417 kilograms in weight. And at that time there were many colonies of them in evidence, and also the land iguanas, which were just about everywhere. Darwin's voyage was in fact a small part of his entire round-the-world trip, which was quite exceptional. While I was planning this trip, I remembered reading about a mayday called by a British sailor making his way down the same coastal stretch that we were planning to sail on. An underwater fitting on his sailboat fractured with age, and he was taking on water faster than his electric bilge pumps could sling it overboard. He calculated that he could remain afloat for about another couple of hours in the frigid and increasingly storming weather, which was about as long as his physical strength could rotate the backup mechanical bilge pump. Luckily, a nearby British tanker captain answered the call, but he was initially unable to come close enough to the tiny yacht because of the rolling and pitching caused by the massive beam sea, as you can see here in this tanker close to the sailboat. This made chilling reading, I have to say. The skipper of the 600-foot-long tanker tried several different approaches to come close to this Tupperware yacht, and on his fifth attempt he was finally able to place his massive ship broadside to the oncoming waves, creating a temporary pool of calm water close to the yacht. This bought him sufficient time for the tanker crew to winch down 2 gas-powered pumps that saved the day. The sailor was able to make his way into a quiet cove, and using a special epoxy that works and sets underwater, he limped into Puerto Williams for a more permanent fix. And as you can see from these maps, it's quite a distance down from Canada right across South America to reach Chile. Chile is a magnificent country with attractive people, great food, splendid scenery, an absolutely vibrant culture, exceptional national resources and superb wines. And it has a really bright future, but it was not always like that. During the Allende years in the early 70s, Chile lurched haphazardly towards a form of democratic socialism, electing a moderately leftist government with lofty ideals. This was the time of President Allende, who is seen here addressing the people. Unfortunately, Colonel Pinochet, a serving army officer, had other ideas, and with the help of the CIA was forcibly able to overturn the democratically elected Allende government and impose what turned out to be a reign of terror. I remember visiting soon after the coup and purchasing a black market booklet with transcripts of the actual radio conversations between Pinochet's men and their CIA advisors. This was amazing reading at the time and allowed a foreign observer such as me to visualize what was happening behind the scenes and how Pinochet's secret police and military forces were being coached. The colonel, later President Pinochet, the regime was grippingly captured in the movie called Missing, a 1982 dramatic film directed by Costa Gavras, starring Jack Lemmon and Sissy Spacek. I've seen the film a number of times and I'm still amazed at the complicity we see. It's based on the true story of American journalist Charles Hoffman, who disappeared into the bloody aftermath of the US-backed Chilean coup of 1973 that deposed President Allende. The film focuses on Horman's father, played by Jack Lemmon of course, who turns up in Santiago searching for the truth about his son's disappearance, and the unforgettable, chilling interview he has with the American consul. The film was banned in Chile during Pinochet's dictatorship, and although neither Chile nor Pinochet are specifically mentioned by name, it's pretty clear what this is all about. Before leaving Canada and representing the biggest coincidence I could imagine, a friend gave me a boat anchor of a book called The Uttermost Part of the Earth. Here we have the book, and it looks a tad daunting at first, but it's well worth it. Written by Lucas Bridges. I took it in hand, smiling an awkward look of thanks for the kind gesture, while mentally calculating the weight it would add to my luggage. This was no ordinary gift though, and it proved to be the key to my entire voyage of discovery. It's a long way down to the tip of South America from where I live, but the advantage of flying in almost a straight line due south over the Earth's crust is the modest time difference between Canada and Chile. So flying from Toronto to Chile is a long haul, but at least you get there at a relatively civilized time when everyone is brewing up the coffee. And because of its importance, I'm going to continually remind you of this book. My ship, the diminutive Terra Australis, sailed from Punta Arenas south of the capital. This was the old Terra Australis, which later burnt and sank on the southwest coast of Chile, but at that time she was a capable, well-founded small ship, having plied these southern waters for some time. She called at smaller ports, such as we see in the Norwegian fjords, and occasionally along the coastline of Newfoundland and also in Labrador. The geography here is incredibly intricate, and as you can see from my moving map, Tierra del Fuego is a series of bays and stretches lined with mountains, and really a tremendous challenge for a skipper to navigate through. My trip at the end really focused on Harberton Farm, which you can see in the map just above. Not too far from Ushuaia, in fact, but a little tricky to get there by land until you get into the centre of Harberton Bay. Capacity-wise, she held 100 guests in 50 outside cabins with a crew of 23 in an atmosphere of conviviality and inclusiveness. A few days later, it came to mind that that porthole would be virtually underwater as our little ship lurched from side to side and from beam to beam, taking a pounding in Darwin's Southern Ocean. You can almost navigate these waters using a penguin paperback of Charles Darwin's Voyage of the Beagle. This book is the seminal account of his exploration to examine the origins of species, and he sailed onward from the Galapagos, naming the Beagle Channel after his boat and eventually recording his extraordinary discoveries in the Galapagos. Take a moment to look at a world map and locate southern Chile and Argentina, and you'll soon be familiar with this magnificent and to some extent terrifying landscape. This craggy coastline is laced with thousands of inlets. There are few ports of refuge, and as our British sailor discovered, there's not much shelter to harbour a lone mariner. The wind here blows for weeks on end with almost nothing to break it up, and it just seems as though it's a compelling reason to not be sailing in this part of the world. One must accept the explorers like Darwin and Drake as they grope their way around Cape Horn and along this coastline in search of heavens knows what, and on behalf of some royal patron back in England or even back in Spain. At this point, Terra Australis was making a run for it down this exposed South Atlantic coastline for the relatively sheltered Beagle Channel, which we reached next morning after a memorable and partially sleepless night. However, the rewards for enduring the sea state were absolutely awesome, and over the next few days we were able to visit magnificent glaciers and deep secluded bays, frequently launching our Zodiacs to stalk wildlife that would have been impossible on a conventional and much larger ship. In the magnificent Agostini Sound, we anchored facing a huge glacier whose ice mass was cascading down the mountainside, carving chunks of millennia cold ice into the ocean below. And there was a speck of bay on the north side of the Beagle Channel just east of Ushuaia and due north from Puerto Williams in Chile. Was this the same Harberton Bay where the Bridges had established their home, and could I possibly persuade the skipper to alter his course and put me ashore in one of the ship's Zodiacs so I could go investigating? Well, after an intense discussion, with me being at my persuasive best, the skipper agreed to make an unscheduled stop in Harberton Bay to allow me to visit and verify if this was the original Bridges homestead. And here again on my moving map you can get some idea of the route one would have taken from the Falkland Islands across to Punta Arenas, down some of these quite narrow channels into the bays and along some of the passages en route to Ushuaia. And as you can see on the right hand side of my moving map, we're looking at Harberton Farm in Harberton Bay, which was the home of the Bridges dynasty. My modern voyage of discovery took me down the Straits of Magellan, into the Coburn Passage and along the Beagle Channel. The very names given to this region in the mid-1830s conjure up images of 16th and 17th century three-masted ships, gun ports open, ready for action, as they felt their way through what we now call Tierra del Fuego, or Land of Fire. It was actually Magellan who dubbed this archipelago Tierra del Fuego, because looking towards the land he saw many fires burning all the way along the shoreline. These were set by villagers, hoping to entice the ships onto the rocks to fall upon those who ventured and foundered in this inhospitable territory. Meanwhile, I had now cracked open the book that my friend has very kindly lent me, The Uttermost Part of the Earth by Lucas Bridges, which I was now reading every single chapter, every single night. I then discovered why the book was chosen by the New York Explorers Club as one of the 100 best first-person exploration narratives of the 20th century. This book is the seminal account of how the Bridges emigrated from the UK and created their extraordinary dynasty in Patagonia at their home at Harberton Farm in this tiny little bay. Harberton Farm, or Estancia Harberton, was named after his wife's birthplace in Devon, and it is located about 40 nautical miles east of Ushuaia, where my ship was heading. The Bridges family, who you can see here, settled in the area, and first of all in Ushuaia, and what we're looking at now is an early engraving of the settlement in Ushuaia with the stockade in the foreground, many of the commercial buildings surrounding the small residential homes, and of course the vast mountain in the distance surrounding the entire settlement. After being immersed in this extraordinary story of human endeavour, I now identified quite closely with the family, and I was prepared to hike cross-country from Ushuaia if the skipper was not prepared to stop. Apparently he was sympathetic to my reasoning, and I soon discovered that these were the original buildings which had been lovingly preserved as if waiting for a great man to return. Harberton Farm by this time had started to take place, and you can see the buildings and the residences along with the landing stage for their boat. My early morning Zodiac therefore was the first to leave the ship, and because of my interest and my enthusiasm which I generated among my fellow passengers, there were 3 Zodiacs following behind me. What excites me is that we can now drive all the way from Canada to Harberton Farm, and as you can see, the road has been pushed right through to the settlement. I had a peculiar feeling as I landed on that lovely crescent-shaped bay and gazed up at the gently sloping hill towards Harberton Farm and the plateau above where the original farm buildings described in Lucas Bridges' Uttermost Part of the Earth were located. This feeling was a sort of déjà vu that I'd actually been here before, but of course it was my first visit. This is where the family built their lives, And here was I, an utter stranger from far off Canada, hiking across the paddock to knock on the door and introduce myself. The fact that I shared a minuscule piece of common national heritage with the Bridges lent me a little bit of confidence, but that amazing book is what propelled me forward, plus a consuming desire to see who these people were. There were no dogs to herald my arrival, no donkeys to honk a predatory warning, and definitely no geese to hiss at a stranger. All was strangely quiet in Harberton Farm, save for the relentless wind that blows in this part of the world, until I knocked on the door. You can't bring a small ship into a tiny bay, even in such a remote part of the universe, without anyone noticing, but as the door opened, I had an uneasy feeling that I was about to experience my very own Dr. Livingstone moment. The man in the doorway was smiling a generous welcome as I introduced myself, and when I explained the reason for my visit, he was mildly surprised, but extended a courteous welcome to come inside and be properly welcomed. The farm has now become a more extensive establishment, and with the nearby penguin rookeries has become quite a tourist destination. This man was one of the great-grandchildren of Thomas Bridges, still living in the same farmhouse along with his family, who are now 5th and 6th generation members of the dynasty. He was humbly surprised at my enthusiasm for his marvellous family story and my interest in the adventures of his ancestors. Having devoured every chapter of the book, I was able to hold an in-depth discussion about the path his family had taken from the UK to the Falkland Islands and their mad dash across the South Atlantic to gain a toehold in Tierra del Fuego. In some respects, chatting with this modern Mr. Bridges was a tiny bit anticlimactic, but I have to admit that in other respects it was quite exhilarating. My tour of Harberton Farm was a reverse journey in time, from the years when Thomas Bridges faced his momentous struggle in Tierra del Fuego, first to survive and then to grow his mission, but I was curious to learn what had happened in the intervening years. Although the book has wonderful in-person descriptions of sheep farming and merchant trading in southern Argentina, I learnt from the current Mr. Bridges that farming sheep became an unprofitable occupation for the family, but happily the farm has survived and is now hosting a few visitors from around the globe with a rather lovely B&B arrangement available. The orphan boy found under a London bridge was the root of this exceptional transplanted family, which has endured to this day, literally at the end of the road in Argentina. Mr. Bridges, it's a story he has lived with all of his life, but for me, this has become my very own Dr. Livingstone moment. The farm, with its beautiful location, is really one of those must-see destinations, and I'm sure I'll be travelling back there soon. Our final port of call was Ushuaia, Argentina, and I budgeted some time for looking around, especially as there was a truly odd Canadian connection. During the rule of Juan and Eva Perón, Ushuaia took on an entirely different perspective, I should say, all in keeping with the magnificent beauty around. Ushuaia became the uttermost part of the earth for their political enemies, and the jail in this port city hosted many outspoken critics of their regime. Ushuaia is also the departure point for sailors making a run for Cape Horn and home base for the Argentine Navy's Southern Ocean Patrol Fleet. However, the Canadian connection in Ushuaia was quite different and concerns a quintessential Canadian rodent we know about and love called Castor canadensis, better known as the beaver, who you can see here making his way across an Argentine pond. During the rule of Juan and Eva Perón, the Argentine economy was on a financial roller coaster, to say the least, and this power couple went looking far and wide for techniques and opportunities to boost the economy. But the Perón were thinking way out of the box, reasoning that if specific best practices worked in other countries, then why not in Argentina, and specifically why not in Tierra del Fuego? Their thunderbolt of a brainwave was to import large quantities of Castor canadensis and thereby introduce a totally new beaver industry to the deprived region of Tierra del Fuego by harvesting fur. Beavers are relatively long-living animals and can survive up to 20 years. They are semi-aquatic, as we all know, which allows them to live both underwater and on land. They grow to an average of 15 pounds and there is evidence that in one time certain species grew as large as a black bear. And if you've ever seen the front teeth of a beaver, a bear-sized specimen must have been somewhat awesome. Beavers produce 1 litter each year of between 1 and 4 little offspring. Sadly, this tale does not have a happy ending, but it teaches us once again that we can't tamper with nature and get away with it scot-free, because all of our species are part of an interconnected global consumption chain, and taking beavers to Argentina, where there are no natural predators, introduces a rather dangerous imbalance. And here we can see some of the creative destruction that nature's greatest engineer has created in the forests of Argentina. The beavers did exactly what they do in Canada, which is to build dams to stop water flowing. And with no natural predators, these beaver colonies grew to epic proportions as they built even more dams. And between the dams, the beavers created massive rodent colonies, which they could produce even more beavers. If history has not been kind to the Perron family, but our much-loved national rodent was hardly to blame. I spent several days wandering around Ushuaia because I wanted to get a sense of this southern outpost where the Perron shipped and incarcerated their political enemies, and also to drive into the beaver deforested region and see the destruction for myself. Nowadays there's frequent air service from the capital into Ushuaia, but in the days of Juan and Eva Perron it must have seemed like an eternal journey for their enemies to the uttermost part of the earth. And here we have the Fuegan Railroad, which was inaugurated in 1896 to service the prison system, and an aerial view of the star-shaped prison, which was the design of the day. Nowadays, Ushuaia is a modern southern port, a beautiful metropolis with access to the local hills for hiking, a modern ski resort, and of course exceptional wildlife viewing in the local bay and along the islands. This visit has been full of cultural surprises, exceptional landscapes and endless discoveries. It's the landscapes that really leave a great impression upon one. The wonderful mountain drops and the snow-capped hills, along with the fantastic seashore, make it a remarkable place to visit. Wildlife, of course, is a very strong part of any visit to southern Argentina, with the number of penguin rookeries dotted around the islands. My visits will always be coloured by the extraordinary exploration and missionary endeavours of the Bridges family, who remain a strong part of my consciousness. Chile and Argentina are both magnificent countries, brimming with warm, charming people and distinct differences in their national characteristics. Time spent travelling down here is never quite enough, and I would have loved to linger longer in many ports of call, but there'll always be a next time which can't come soon enough. Thanks again for joining me on another story time for grown-ups. I hope you have enjoyed travelling along with me, and I look forward to our next time together. And until then, take care.